Well, I'll spend half an hour or so telling you about Hegel's philosophy, then we'll switch to Karl Marx for the second part of the lecture. Hegel lived from 1770 to 1831, not that it's an important fact for philosophy, it's an important fact for historians. Now, there are two aspects to Hegel's system, phenomenology and logic. And Hegel made two attempts to write his system. The first attempt in a book that appeared in 1807 called The Phenomenology of Spirit, Phänomenologie des Geistes, and a book which appeared in more than one volume from 1812 called The Science of Logic, Wissenschaft der Logik. These books constitute the first attempt to write his system. But from 1815 onwards, there's a second attempt in a series of books called the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences. And there are books there about dialectic and about phenomenology. Also important is the 1821 book, Philosophy of Right, which is about political philosophy. Now, I'll say something about what phenomenology is, and then I'll say something about what dialectic is. If we look at the title of the 1807 book, Phenomenology of Spirit, or Phänomenologie des Geistes, the word phenomenology means the description of appearances, or the description of what is as it is given. It usually has the connotation of reducing appearances to the given. So the appearance of something is reduced to its appearance, or the thing is reduced to the appearance of the thing. There are different conceptions of phenomenology depending on what's assumed to be given, or what exactly appears as it appears. Now, the other concept in the title, spirit or Geist, the word Geist has to be written with a capital letter. You probably know that the Germans write all their nouns with capital letters. So capital G, E-I-S-T, capital G, E-I-S-T. Now this term Geist is usually translated into English as spirit, That's all right, but we could, that's correct, but we could, the meaning of the word Geist is very rich in German. And Geist has the connotation of spirit, or possibly ghost, or certainly consciousness, even though the Germans have another word for consciousness, Bewusstsein. Nonetheless, by Geist, Hegel often means what we mean by consciousness. Geist, in a sense, can mean the morale of the cricket team or something. I'm not very German about it, but you know what I mean. Now, so if we put the two concepts together, the phenomenology of spirit or the phenomenology of Geist, Hegel's book is an attempt to describe how consciousness appears. Essentially, how consciousness appears to itself. Now, if you look at the contents page of the 1807 Phenomenology of Spirit, there's a complicated system of chapters and subchapters and subdivisions. But when I was studying in Cambridge many years ago, my supervisor, Edward Craig, recommended to me that to read 3 chapters in particular of the Phenomenology of Spirit. He said, read the first chapter, which is called sense certainty. Sense certainty. Read the middle chapter. Read the middle chapter, which is called Master and Slave. Master and Slave. And read the final chapter, which is quite short, which is called Absolute Knowledge or Absolute Knowing. Now, Edward Craig thought that to master the book as a whole, you should climb these three mountain peaks first and survey the valleys and minor peaks in between. Now, I think Craig was right. This gives you this gives you three vistas over the rest of the book, and in a way, possibly these three parts of the book have been the most influential, had the most impact on subsequent philosophy. For example, the middle chapter, Master and Slave, was studied carefully by Karl Marx and provided Marx's model for class struggle, for the way in which society, his model for understanding how societies perpetuate themselves historically and how one society disintegrates and is replaced by its successor. That political model is in a way taken from Hegel by Marx and given an application in Marx's thought, which in other respects is very, very different from Hegel's. Marx is a kind of materialist, for example, and Hegel seems to be a kind of idealist. Now, in the phenomenology of spirit, Hegel thinks that he's described every possible state of consciousness, every possible state of consciousness. Now, or shape of consciousness. The word he uses for shape is Gestalt, or form, or shape, again with a capital G. I think you get this in German, a capital G on Gestalt. So by a state of consciousness, he doesn't mean having this thought rather than that thought. He means an entire complexion of consciousness, or consciousness's form or state as a whole. Now, if we look at the three chapters that Edward Craig recommended to me, in sense certainty, Hegel describes the most rudimentary and simple kind of sensation. The most elementary form of consciousness that is possible, where we can still talk about consciousness. So that's an individual kind of consciousness. A kind of individualism is true in sense certainty, and a kind of empiricism is true. In sense certainty, what appears is naively and simply assumed to be as it is, or to be as it appears. There's a certain naivety in sense certainty. Now, Hegel says something interesting about sense certainty. He says that it appears to be the richest and most sophisticated kind of consciousness, but actually it's the most impoverished and the least yielding of knowledge. So perhaps rather cynically or informatively, Hegel is implying that most of us, most of the time, are embedded in self-certainty, or assume that the kind of everyday consciousness, the kind of empiricism that we display on an everyday basis, we assume this is right, but actually it's a naive view that contains its own seeds of destruction within itself. Roughly speaking, sense certainty only presents the object, but it presupposes a subject as well as an object, but the subject is not knowable by sense certainty. And sense certainty also seems to presuppose an object that exceeds the given, but again, that's not knowable by sense certainty. So these Gestalten, or forms of consciousness that run through the book, each one contains presuppositions which are not explicable from within the particular form of consciousness. And these presuppositions give rise to the next form of consciousness. Now, if we move ahead to the master and slave dialectic, in this chapter, Hegel is interested in the transition from consciousness to self-consciousness, how it's possible to move from being a conscious being to being a self-conscious being. Now, Hegel thinks that this transition is only possible through membership of a society. A conscious being can only become a self-conscious being if it's a member of a society of conscious beings. And it's the encounter or even conflict or struggle between one consciousness and another that gives rise to self-consciousness in each of the antagonistic beings. Now, there are various preconditions for becoming self-conscious. To become self-conscious, it's necessary for the consciousness to draw a self-not-self distinction, a self-not-self distinction. In other words, each of us divides the universe into two portions. The portion that you call me, you call yourself, right? And the remainder, which is not you, or which you do not call yourself, or you do not call me. In other words, it's a necessary condition for self-consciousness is drawing a self-not-self distinction. Secondly, according to Hegel, a necessary condition for self-consciousness is drawing a self-other distinction. Now, the self-other distinction is a me, everybody else distinction, or a me, somebody else distinction. And Hegel thinks that these distinctions are only possible if there is desire. If there is desire. Now, why does he think that desire is crucial in establishing these necessary conditions? Well, Hegel thinks that desire produces a mismatch or an asymmetry between the state of oneself and the state of the world, or a mismatch or an asymmetry between the desirer and the desired, or the way the desire is and the way the world is. And this is how the self-not-self distinction is established according to Hegel. Now, you can put in brackets that somebody might say, oh, well, you can desire what you've already had, or what you've already got. But this is a pedantic point, really. I mean, supposing I'm so spoiled that I long to own a toy train set, and I'm so spoiled I've forgotten that in the loft I've got a perfectly running toy train set. Oh, a priest, he desires things he's already got. Now, that's perfectly possible, but that's not what Hegel's talking about. He means that paradigmatically we desire things that we don't have. Right? We can make mistakes, but there's only desire if there's desire for things that we don't have. Okay, now understanding self-consciousness is quite subtle or quite difficult. There's a difference between being conscious of the being that one is, being conscious of the being that one is, and being self-conscious. Or being self-conscious entails being conscious of the being that one is. But being conscious of the being that one is does not entail being self-conscious. Now, what I mean by this is supposing a being is conscious of the being that it is, but not self-conscious. It could be like this. I mean, supposing this being, priest, is such a being, then such a being could go through the universe like this and say, sort of modernist 1960s Czech. Professor Locke. A blue V-necked pullover. Cheek. Thought about red wine. Or, sort of strange, what Crick would call a lectern or something. All right. Or thought about Hegel. Human being going a bit grey. Poorly. Now, this being is conscious of the being that it is. This being is conscious of the being that it is. Amongst other things, it is conscious of the being that it is. One's tempted to say it is conscious of itself. One's even tempted to say it is conscious of itself. But there's something missing. There's something missing. There's something missing from this which will turn that into self-consciousness. Now, the really hard question is what is missing. Now, one's inclined to say, well, in the case of fully fledged self-consciousness, it's not just aware of this thing that it is, it knows it is the thing that it's aware of. It knows that it is the thing that it's aware of. Or it knows that it is identical with the being that it is aware of. But what's that? What's that? What is it for it to know that it is identical with the being that it's aware of? Now, Hegel says about this, consciousness draws a distinction. Consciousness draws a distinction which at the same time is not a distinction. Consciousness draws a distinction which at the same time is not a distinction. Someone who doesn't like Hegel very much can slam the book shut in frustration at this moment. But in a way there's a distinction, and in a way there's no distinction. Hegel tries to explain himself. He says what it distinguishes from itself is only itself. What it distinguishes from itself is only itself. In other words, in self-consciousness, there is a subject-object structure. There's a distinction between subject in the sense of that which is conscious and object in the sense of what consciousness is directed towards. But, that's the distinction, but the subject is the object. The subject is the object. What it is conscious of is that which is conscious, or that which is conscious is identical with what consciousness is conscious of. So we could ask, though, how is that possible? How is that possible? How do we get to that? Well, Hegel thinks that self-consciousness in this fully fledged way is only possible through thinking of oneself under a description, or thinking of oneself under some concept, subsuming oneself under some concept. So if you're conscious of yourself, according to Hegel, you're conscious of yourself as blank, as an American, or as English, or as German, or as a human being, or as a student, or as something or other. Now, the conceptual resources for filling in the blank come from the other. In other words, Hegel thinks we can't spin out of our own minds in a solipsistic or solitary or completely Cartesian way. We can't just dream up as a solitary individual concepts like JYA student or Dominican brother or student in the University of Oxford or something like that. We don't just magically, solipsistically invent these to apply to ourselves. They come from society. Now, this means that the developed self-consciousness that we have depends upon not just the existence of the other, i.e. other people, but an encounter with the other. Now, in the master and slave dialectic, fully, as it goes on, fully developed, there is an antagonistic struggle between master and slave. Master and slave are two different kinds of consciousness. It's quite complicated because later on, towards the end of the chapter, Hegel says that, the master is really the slave and the slave is really the master. But it's complicated enough without saying that really. And in the next chapter about Stoicism and so on, it turns out that the master and slave dialectic is also happening inside everybody's mind, each person's mind as well, which makes it even more complicated. But anyway, the master has a hold or a mastery over the slave because the master can grant or withhold the slave's identity. The master can grant or withhold your identity as blank. You can't just self-appoint as what you are. So the master controls your essence. Now, in the master and slave dialectic, at one point, which again anticipates Marx, a quasi-economic interpretation is given to the relationship because the master forces the slave to make commodities. In other words, to fashion physical objects so that they are means to human ends, to manipulate matter into forms which, if you could see them, would look like the human mind, or if you could see the human mind. I suppose you can see the objects which have the forms. It's not clear you can see the forms. Now, inadvertently, this gives the slave, or provides the slave with the possibility of overthrowing the master, because in the chapter, the slave fashioning commodities enables the slave to see their reflection or their image or their handiwork in the manipulated objects, and this is something that the master lacks. Now, there's a lot more to the master and slave dialectic. I'll have to move on to other topics now. But in the German, the title is Herrschaft und Knechtschaft. Herrschaft und Knechtschaft. And that doesn't have to be translated master and slave. It could be, A.V. Miller, who's a very nice chap, Hegel translator I knew, he died when he was about 90. He translates it as lordship and bondage, but that translation doesn't seem to have caught on as well. It's master and slave. Now, I'll say something about dialectic. Before dialectic, sorry for the short bit there, I'll just say that absolute knowing is the highest form of consciousness. Now, depending on how we read Hegel, absolute knowing is cosmic consciousness, or absolute knowing at the end of the 1807 book is the knowledge of reality's knowledge of itself, or reality's self-realization as self-consciousness. So, self-consciousness is the right model for understanding reality throughout the book. But self-consciousness really is exhibited as reality at the end of the book. Now, absolute knowing is the totality of finite perspectives that individual consciousnesses have on the world. There's a relativism of perspectives, but the totality of those are parts of absolute knowing, which is what is knowing what it is. Now, Hegel tries to explain absolute knowing by saying there's no difference ultimately between these two things. Number one, what is being what it is? What is being what it is? And number two, what is knowing what it is? There's no difference between its being what it is and its knowing what it is. Now, this doesn't just mean that it gets itself right, it knows what it is. It means that the distinction between epistemology and ontology is deliberately collapsed by Hegel at the end of the book. Now, the reason why there's no difference between its being what it is and its knowing what it is that ultimate reality is itself a form of self-consciousness, according to Hegel. So, to put it crudely, the more it knows about itself, the more it is itself, or the more it grows in self-consciousness, the more it is what it is. Now, okay, that's probably enough about the phenomenology. I'll say something about dialectic now. This can be found in two places, in the 1812 book, The Science of Logic, and the volume of the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences called The Lesser Logic, which is the Logic, which came out after 1815. Now, dialectic is a method of problem solving, according to Hegel. Hegel says that in philosophy, when we do philosophy, we oppose one position to another, free will and determinism, mind and body, space and time, individual and social, public and private, here and there, sacred and profane, subjective and objective, infinite and finite, beginning, no beginning. Obviously, this picture, in a way, is taken from Kant's antinomies. But Hegel thinks that when we do philosophy, when we ordinarily do philosophy, we privilege one concept over its opposite. So I might argue that determinism is true, and you're supposed to argue that free will is true. Or I might argue that the mind is the brain, and you might argue that consciousness is something distinct from the brain, and so on. Now, Hegel says that this is ordinary philosophy. This is how we conduct ordinary philosophy. But to do dialectic, we have to realize that each concept in each pair does apply. So if we're to understand what a human being is, or if we're to understand what the universe is, or if we're to understand what consciousness is, we have to understand that we, or the subject matter, is both free and determined, both individual and social, both subjective and objective, both public and private. And it's a mistake of ordinary philosophy to amass arguments to suppress one side of the opposition and privilege the other side of the opposition. So Hegel draws a distinction between what he calls analytic and synthetic philosophy. In analytic philosophy, we're supposed to decompose concepts into their conceptual parts, but in synthetic philosophy, we're supposed to put together pairs of opposed concepts in order to construct solutions to philosophical problems. Now, this is the technique of philosophical problem solving, which he calls dialectic. If you look at either of the logic books, you'll see that Hegel thinks that there are two concepts which are so fundamental that unless you possess these two concepts, you don't have any concepts. The first of these is being, and the second is nothingness, or nothing. Being and nothingness are the two primordial concepts. Being and nothingness are the two fundamental concepts which begin Hegel's dialectic. Somebody who can't distinguish between being and nothing can't distinguish between anything and anything, according to Hegel. Now, Hegel says that being and nothingness are opposed concepts, but they have a synthesis or a reconciliation or a coming together. They're complementary in that they come together in the synthesis, which he calls becoming. So being and nothing are opposed. Sein and nichts are opposed. But being and nothing come together in becoming, or werden, which is the combination of being and nothing. Now, I'll say that the relationship between being and nothing is quite complicated. If we look at it, has the following features. Number one, being and nothing are opposites. Number two, being and nothing are the same. Being and nothing are the same. Now, this has irritated, visibly irritated commentators. But we have to try to make sense of what he means by this. They're opposites, but they're the same. Now, one fairly liberal or loose way of understanding Hegel is to say that by the same, he can't possibly mean the same. He must mean some weaker relation than the same. He must mean they're mutually dependent. In other words, there's no being without nothing, and there's no nothing without being. This is not wrong. I think this is all right as far as it goes, this interpretation. But unfortunately, it's not enough. By the same, he does mean the same. He says he means identical, identisch. He means they're one and the same. Now, by being, he means pure being. He doesn't mean being F. He means being rather than not being. He doesn't mean being something or other. He means being rather than not being. And by nothing, he means nothing at all. He doesn't mean not being something or other. He means not being rather than being. Now, Hegel says, the more we investigate pure being, or the more fully we realize that being is not being something, not being F, the more we begin to encounter nothing, or pure nothingness. And conversely, the more we realize that nothing is not being something, but is pure nothingness, the more we begin to encounter pure being. In other words, being has a kind of nothingness at its heart, and nothingness has a kind of being at its heart. Within nothingness, there is nothingness rather than no nothingness, so there's a kind of being in nothingness. But being is not anything, so there isn't anything that one could encounter in being which would save it from being nothing. So being and nothing are mutually dependent and arguably identical at root. Becoming is the synthesis of being and nothingness, because the attempt to think being leads to nothingness, and the attempt to think nothingness leads to being. So there's an oscillation between being and nothingness, and this is becoming. So by becoming, Hegel means changing. On one model of change, on one well-known model of change, there is change if and only if x is f at t1 and x is not f at t2, or vice versa. All right, that's one model of change. In other words, change is gaining or losing properties. X is f at t1, x is not f at t2, or the other way around. X is not f at t1, and x is f at t2. On that view, becoming or change is gaining and losing properties. But Hegel is interested in the transition itself between being f and being not f, or between being not f and being f, the transition itself. Now, the transition itself is a synthesis of being and nothing. It's the movement from being to nothing, and from nothing to being, or from existence to non-existence, and from non-existence to existence. I mean, to see this, we could ask a question which Hegel does not ask at the beginning of the dialectic. What is beginning? What is it for something to begin? What is a beginning? Now, arguably, it's very hard to conceptualize or understand what it consists in for there to be a beginning. We think we can understand it, but if we think of beginning, arguably we're thinking of a process that's already underway. And if we don't think of beginning, we're thinking of a process that's not yet underway. I mean, given that we're trying to think of beginning. But thinking of the beginning itself, the actual transition from not being to being, is conceptually terribly difficult, but Hegel thinks the term becoming captures this transition. Similarly with ending, the transition from from being to not being. Now, I'll say something about Marx. In the other lectures on the philosophy of history, I'll say a lot more about Marx. I'll just say something today about the question, is Marx a philosopher? The question is Marx a philosopher? Now, if you look at the theses on Feuerbach, very interesting set of statements by Marx, the final thesis on Feuerbach, thesis 11, has the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. This is actually one of the kindest and least rude things that Marx says about academic philosophy, some of which I wouldn't want to repeat in front of this audience. Now, I think, well, the young Marx studied philosophy, but became much more interested in devising a theory of history and a theory of economics, which would be prescriptive, which would help to overthrow capitalist society, which he regards as unjust, as systematically leading to inequality, and he thinks that inequality is unjust. Now, having said that, I think it's possible to say that Marx is a philosopher in spite of himself, or malgré lui. And I'll mention 7 respects in which it seems to me that Marx can be read as a philosopher amongst other philosophers. Number 1, Marx has a logic, but Marx's logic is dialectic. Now, Marx, as I just said, is very interested in Hegel's master and slave dialectic, but he's also steeped in Marx's dialectic, Marx's technique of problem solving. In Hegel, the dialectic is, roughly speaking, relationships between universals. If you think of universals as opposed to particulars as either essential properties of reality as a whole, or the most fundamental concepts that we can have that make empirical concepts possible, something like that. If you think of universals like that, Hegel is interested in the conceptual oppositions between universals. Now, in Marx, we can say that this logic, in single quotation marks, is applied to society. And Marx thinks that there are contradictions in feudal society which give rise to capitalist society. And there are contradictions in capitalist society which will give rise to a brief socialist society, the so-called dictatorship of the proletariat, in which the people who own capital, as opposed to the people who work, will be killed. And so that overcomes that contradiction. And that leads to a communist society which is devoid of private property. You probably have a toothbrush or something. But certainly the means of production, in other words, the physical means by which a society perpetuates itself, will not be in private ownership, it will be in public ownership. Now, contradiction here does not mean anymore opposition between universals. It doesn't mean a case of both P and not P either. It means a third thing. It means antagonism between two classes. It means the antagonism between two classes, which will issue in a third state of affairs, or in a new kind of society. Now, you can ask, well, is that a kind of logic? Well, it wouldn't get you very far. Sort of propositional and predicate logic and stuff with it, but you can see there's a kind of logic. The notion of contradiction has been incorporated into a social theory. Secondly, it seems to me that Marx has an ontology. Ontology, you remember, is the attempt to answer the question, what is there? or what exists. And Marx's ontology is materialism. Now we have to be careful about saying that Marx's ontology is materialism, because materialism, strictly speaking, is the doctrine that everything is physical, or a second way of describing it would be to say that there's nothing that's not physical. Everything is physical in every detail. Now, Marx does not think that. Marx thinks that consciousness exists. Now, consciousness, however, depends upon the physical world, according to Marx, and forms of consciousness depend upon economics, in particular the way in which a particular society is organised economically. Now we could say, in brackets, strictly speaking, this is not a kind of materialism, it's a kind of epiphenomenalism. In other words, it's a kind of dualism where consciousness or forms of consciousness are a consequence of material relations. But it's not Cartesian dualism. There are no spiritual substances, according to Marx. There's no God, there's no soul. The consciousness itself is not a substance. The only substances are physical substances, and if we want, we can call that a kind of materialism. Maybe we should. Marx's name for his own theory is dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism, which incorporates the 2 points that we've made. That's really the logic plus the ontology. I should say, in connection with this ontology, that the young Marx, in the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, usefully reprinted in the Penguin book, Marx' Early Writings, edited by Lucio Coletti, which is probably on readers. Marx draws a distinction between ideology and economic base, or a distinction between superstructure, which is consciousness, and economic base, which is the material organisation of society, the means of production, i.e. the factories and fields and machines and tools and so on, and the relations of production, i.e. The class structure of the society in virtue of which it's organised economically. Now, in classical Marxism, economic determinism is true, that economic changes in society are necessary and sufficient for transitions to further forms of social organisation. But for various reasons in the 20th century, some Marxist writers have allocated causal efficacy to ideology. Certain Marxist writers say that the ideology of the society has an effect on the economics and has an effect on perpetuating capitalist society when otherwise we would expect it to be overthrown by revolution. His thinkers include, for example, Georg Lukács, the Hungarian Marxist, Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist revolutionary who was murdered by Mussolini in jail, and Louis Althusser, who some of Althusser's work has been translated by Professor Locke, who's sitting on the front row here. Althusser and Locke were pals in the 1960s when they were radical students. And merely biographical facts, so it can't matter to philosophy code. Right, now, the third question is whether Marx has an epistemology. It's certainly not a priority for Marx to decide on a definition of the word knowledge or something like that, or even to decide on whether there are limits to metaphysical knowledge. He simply endorses a view like Kant's, according to which metaphysics is completely impossible along with a lot of subsequent philosophy. But I think that Marx's books, the Capital, the most famous work of 1867, and the early manuscripts, in a way constitute an epistemology, or constitute a theory of history, or knowledge of how history works, or putative knowledge of how history works. Then, fifthly, we can ask whether Marx has a philosophy of mind. Well, I'm inclined to say yes. It's the ideology's relationship to the economic base. Sixthly, does Marx have a philosophy of religion? Yes, atheism. And seventhly, does Marx have a kind of ethics? Well, yes. Communism, he thinks that private property is evil, it leads to injustice, so we should abolish private property through revolution. Marx thinks that after the revolution, the state in capitalist society will dissolve, or, as he puts it, wither away. The reason why the state will dissolve or wither away is that, according to Marx, the state is the instrument of the capital-owning class. The state is the instrument of the capital-owning class. By the state, he means Parliament, if there is one, Congress, Senate, the Cabinet, the Prime Minister, the President, the police, the army, the law courts, the judiciary. This is the state apparatus. This will just collapse because it is the tool which operates in the interests of the capital-owning class. In the dictatorship of the capital-owning class, in the dictatorship on the capital-owning class by the proletariat, by the working class, the capitalists have killed. So there is no wielder of this instrument called the state. Another way of looking at Marx is to say that Marx privileges political philosophy. You can read it as political philosophy, including applied political philosophy. Now, I'm reading Marx as doing philosophy, and he doesn't want to be read as doing philosophy, so I'm doing some violence to his intentions and preoccupations. But there are other people who privilege one kind of philosophy over another. For example, the logical positivists think that the natural sciences provide the model for doing philosophy, or it's perhaps better put by saying that the logical positivists massively privilege scientific understanding and try to play down or abolish other ways of philosophical thinking and understanding. Or Frege, Wittgenstein and Michael Dummett think that philosophy is essentially the philosophy of language. Well, Michael Dummett used to say that philosophy is essentially the philosophy of language. Obviously, we should draw a distinction between philosophy of language and linguistic philosophy. Philosophy of language is the attempt to solve philosophical problems about language, about meaning, about sense, and about reference, how language works. And linguistic philosophy is the thesis that philosophical problems can be rewritten as linguistic problems, or merely verbal or grammatical problems. But there's clearly an intimate relationship between the two theses, and it's not an accident that a lot of philosophy of language is done by linguistic philosophers and vice versa. Or Kant and the British empiricists privilege epistemology as a way of doing philosophy. And, well, perhaps St. Augustine privileges philosophy of religion, perhaps Aquinas as well. So we could understand Marx as privileging political philosophy over other kinds of philosophy. Now, there seem to be three features to this privileging that goes on. Number one, unless we can do this kind of philosophy, we can't do philosophy. Number two, this kind of philosophy by and large shows all other kinds of philosophy to be worthless. And thirdly, other philosophy should be rewritten as this kind of philosophy. Well, Marx, it seems to me, fits this pattern. Now, Marx's political philosophy includes a social theory, a powerful social theory, which has the following main tenets. Number one, the social is not reducible to the individual. In other words, the individual acts only because the class acts. This is important in Marxism. The class, in the sense of the social class, is the unit of history. Everything that's done in history is done by social classes, and everything that happens in history happens to social classes. And if anything happens to individuals or anything else, it's as a result of that. Secondly, economic determinism is true. I've mentioned that we could put in brackets Lukács, Gramsci, Althusser, and for that matter Jean-Paul Sartre, who was a Marxist for much of his career, have reservations about economic determinism. Very roughly, they don't think it's entirely true. Now, we could raise a couple of questions about these two tenets of the social theory. If it's the class that acts, not the individual in history, then do we really need Lenin, Mao, Castro, or indeed Marx and Engels? I mean, if the classes are going to do it all, why do we need seemingly extremely significant individuals? Well, there's an interesting book by Plekhanov called The Role of the Individual in History that tries to explain this. Roughly speaking, these people are expressions of class interest or have power because the class they represent, not necessarily belong to, is growing in power. And we can raise a question about the economic determinism, which is only in classical Marxism. That's Capital and the theories of Marx and Engels. It's not the economic determinism is not in the early Marx, the 1844 manuscripts, and it's not in these important Marxist thinkers in the 20th century. If economic determinism is true, why do we have to bother making choices to be Marxist? Why do we have to bother selling newspapers in the street, or going to Marxist meetings, or deciding to join a Marxist trade union or something like that, if it's all going to happen anyway through the inevitable economic determinism? Now, these questions are addressed by various Marxist thinkers. I mean, Sartre, for example, thinks that free will and determinism are the inside and the outside of the same phenomenon, that the individual and the class act on the world, and the world acts on the individual and the class. In other words, there's a relationship of dialectical reciprocity between them. Now, I'll just finish off by making 4 points of affinity between Marx and Kant. It's well known that Marx criticizes Hegel, takes the dialectic from Hegel, but turns Marx onto his feet, or possibly onto his head in some translations, and replaces Hegel's idealism with materialism. But in a way, in some ways, Marx goes to a pre-Hegelian position. The categories become classes. Kant's categories become classes. The classes, in a way, are a posteriori, because they're discovered in history, by studying history, but in a way they're an a priori given in Marxism. You and I and everybody else can't easily escape our class location and operating within that class location. Secondly, Kant's concept of synthesis. Synthesis is the interpretation of objects through categories. Kant's concept of synthesis becomes praxis in Marx. In Marx, praxis, which is just the Greek word for action, is the manipulation of matter in accordance with human projects. Thirdly, Kant's transcendental unity of apperception, which is individualistic, becomes class consciousness in Marx. It's possible for a class to become conscious of itself, of its true nature and its destiny. And fourthly and finally, in Kant, dialectic, which is a spurious method of problem solving, becomes a genuine method of problem solving in Marx. Okay, that's enough.